Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and tonight we are showing one of the very finest examples of pre-code filmmaking from the early 1930s. It is director Lewis Milestone's Rain, starring the incomparable, legendary Joan Crawford at the peak of her youth and beauty. But she was always beautiful, but she's just stunning in this film. She's amazing, and she's certainly a character. Joining us tonight is our resident pre-code expert and historian, Mr. Stan Shaffer. How are you doing tonight, Stan?
Hello, Ryan. I'm very good. Rain was such a huge hit on Broadway that it came with a legend involved with it. Somerset Maugham, of course, wrote it. John Colton wrote the play itself. But the show itself, it influenced every actress of that era because it starred the incomparable Jeannie Eagles. Now, Jeannie Eagles was someone that people like Crawford, Stanwyck, Davis all compared themselves to if they had the honor of actually seeing her on stage. Walter Catlett did this show, Rain, with Miss Crawford, and he said, when Jeannie Eagles died, Rain died. That's the impression she had on everyone, and that's what Joan Crawford had to think about when she took on this very challenging role.
And it's interesting, even though this movie only came out in 1932, there had already been multiple iterations of it. Even Gloria Swanson had done a silent film version of this play only 4 years earlier.
Oscar nominated, and she was opposite the great Lionel Barrymore. So,
Yeah.
and Swanson at that point was the biggest star of her day. She made an easy transition to talkies, and so Crawford had to think about that. But what was something about this was Crawford wanted this role so bad, she wanted it. Now, Joseph Schenck, who was the head of United Artists, arranged with Louis Mayer and Thalberg to borrow her. And this movie, Rain, was the first time she left her home studio.
Hmm.
And at this point, she was a young girl of, well, Joan Crawford's age varied, but I would say she was probably 25 or 26.
Hmm.
And she'd been pampered. We talk about the star system, but no one polished their stars better than MGM.
Right.
And Crawford was up there. She wasn't at the very top was Garbo and Cher, and then was Crawford. But
Hmm.
Crawford's movies made the money that made all the others happen once she started her her major role, the one that everyone could identify with, was the young girl trying to get ahead, a shop girl, a girl from the other side of the tracks. That was Joan Crawford, a very popular genre in pre-code, very popular. She wanted this role, and so they decided to loan her out. She decided, and she got very nervous about it because they cast the show with a lot of stage veterans. And then that meant her being a little intimidated. So she also set it up with MGM that when they borrowed her, they borrowed Oliver Marsh. Now, Oliver Marsh was a great cinematographer at that period. Once again, like Crawford was on the hierarchy with Garbo and Cher, well, he's on the hierarchy below William Daniels. And so she felt secure if she had him. And that was a very good decision, a very good decision that he came along with her.
Her performance, her visual appearance in this film, it's very unique because, of course, the character of Sadie Thompson, she's a woman of ill repute, but she has such a very distinctive look to her wardrobe, her makeup. Everything seems very finely kind of curated. How much of that was Joan Crawford's input? How much of that was director Lewis Milestone?
Once again, we're going to go back to what a star was at MGM. And a star at MGM meant that makeup had to be perfect. Throughout her life, Joan Crawford was the star. She did not go out shopping unless she was dressed as Joan Crawford to go out shopping. And so that would be important coming over it. Milestone, see, Lewis Milestone was one of the great directors of pre-code era. He had won the Oscar for All Quiet on the Western Front, and he actually won an Oscar earlier for a silent movie he made called Two Arabian Nights.
Mhm.
So he's already a two-time Oscar winner coming into this. That also made Joan Crawford feel a little more secure. But when she got there, she found out that he had things set in his mind. He would set things as to how things would be, and then he would rehearse with the stage group quite a bit. But see, the key to Joan Crawford, one of the keys, is that she is raw. And that's what made her work with Jeannie Eagles. Jeannie Eagles was probably the rawest actress that we had in film, died too early, but that was a key. Joan Crawford was raw. That meant instinct is important. And with the instinct being so important, it didn't work as well with all these people being stage actors around her. The great Walter Huston was one of the greatest stage actors of all time,
Mhm.
and he was in it. So she had to really work at it. And once again, her insecurities came to the forefront.
I think she gives an incredible performance. This is a very gripping film. As we mentioned, it is a pre-code film, and I would probably put it up there just in terms of like shock, impact, what it has to offer. It has to be at least in the top 10, maybe even top five pre-code movies ever made.
It certainly is up there.
Right. And so, like, what does our audience have to look forward to in terms of pre-code material without spoiling the film?
Well, once again, they know exactly what they have to look forward to because of what Milestone said. Once again, what I just said before was that Milestone had things set in his mind, and so he realized one of the most important items for this film was the introduction of Joan Crawford as Sadie Thompson. And so that very first scene, as it's just very set, the precise timing of how she appears at that door, the audience knows what to expect. This is a woman who, well, she makes ends meet. That's the case with many times in pre-code. She makes ends meet. And she enjoys male company. So here she is. She's Sadie Thompson. And but an interesting thing, one of the people who really wanted to play Sadie Thompson was like the incarnation on Broadway beyond Jean Eagles, not as good an actress, but was Tallulah Bankhead.
Mhm.
And Tallulah Bankhead was a fine actress. She actually got to do a revival a few years later than this, but she wanted the role also. And you can think about she would also be perfect because she had just that right little attitude. And I don't know if I could say, but when Somerset Maugham said that she was the one who actually had blank me heels when she would walk, I
Mhm.
won't say the word, but you know what I mean because we got to, the code is in effect a little bit here, so we got to make sure we don't say that word, and so we
Yeah.
won't.
All right. Well, Stan, thank you so much. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1932, Rain. It's hard to believe this movie is 92 years old at this point. I mean, it's incredible.
It is. Yeah, it has aged very well. Actually, when it came out, the reception was not very good, and it
Mhm.
just made Joan realize her insecurities even more. The critics were not good. They even took Milestone, who was coming off, like I said, 2 Oscars. They even took him to task, and Walter Huston, who is like a paragon of great criticism, even got some problems. So the movie itself did not do very well. Immediately after making that movie, she felt, oh no, I don't ever want to leave my studio again. She wanted, because at the studio, like I said about shining those stars, they're surrounded by all these people they know. And so they feel comfortable. It's like a family. And Joan loved that. Joan loved that feeling. And that's what made her such a great star also, was what Mayer brought. So right after this, then, one of the reasons she did this was she was really basking in glory right before this, because she had made Grand Hotel. And Grand Hotel was one of the first all-star movies. Thalberg put it all together, and he topped it with Garbo. How and the Barrymores, and Joan held her own. She got as good reviews as they did. In fact, sometimes people feel she stole the movie, and she's brilliant in it. She's brilliant. So she did feel a little ready to do another step in her evolution as an actress and not just a star. And
Mhm.
so this was important to her. But the movie flopped, reviews were, and later in the interviews, she would call it a turkey. She would say sometimes she'd like to get every print of it and burn it. She didn't
Oh
want to have
no.
anything to do with it. And it's sad because, like you had said, it's one of the greatest pre-codes. And one of the reasons what make some of the great pre-codes is there's certain modern aura to them because the mores change. And as we look at them today, our mores will make those pre-codes sound a little more modern than some of the things that followed.
Right.
And there she was.
Mhm.
And once again, back to that rawness, you know, the only other actress that had to communicate that kind of rawness at that time, besides Crawford, and of course Eagles had passed away, was Stanwyck, Barbara Stanwyck. That raw element that helped her become, she made one of the other great pre-codes of all time, Babyface.
It was
Uh,
a
uh,
wonderful era. I mean, well, especially for actresses, for women, the early 1930s, these were star-making performances. When we think of Barbara Stanwyck in Babyface, Betty Davis in Of Human Bondage, and of course Joan Crawford in Rain, these were career-making. Well, I guess Joan Crawford had already been established, but for these other two, these would launch these women on these incredible career trajectories.
But Joan, she another reason why we're talking about Rain and her being a star, she had that hierarchy we're talking about. So, when you're talking about great actresses, the pre-code, we have to mention Norma Shear also. And Norma Shear won the Oscar for Divorcee. So she wanted to show that she had some real dramatic talent too, that it was all about Norma Shear. So when she went when you read books, and I have, I'm actually going to show you here, I have her autobiography here.
Mhm.
And when you read these things and you hear from her, she never got over how much she disliked and was jealous of Norma Shearer.
Oh,
I had the tremendous honor to see her in person. She did part of a series that John Springer did called Legendary Ladies of the Screen. And it would just be John Springer and the person involved, and that would be Joan Crawford. So this was April 8th, 1974. I was very young then. And I made my way to New York. I lived in Pennsylvania. And they showed clips of her films, and then she came out. She made this great royal entrance like a star she would be. And we had on little 3x5 cards, we had written down questions that we'd like to ask her. And I had written, what was it like to work with Norma Shearer? Well,
oh,
she took a beat and she said, when we did the women, Miss Shearer made me change one costume over 20 times. And that's where she left it.
oh wow.
That's where she left it. But I'll add one more thing because of doing Baby Jane last week, like you did. When they asked her, someone else, of course, asked her, well, what was it like to work with Betty Davis? And she said, some people like to scream in the morning. I like to knit. So she had a very good way of how she showed it. And, such a star. At the end of the program, she got up and she had this wonderful dress on that was cut so she could show her legs. So she walked on the stage and they brought roses to her. And don't forget, this is a woman who was 68 years old at that time. She was
Mhm.
impeccable. And of course, we served Pepsi for intermission.
You had to get the Pepsi in there, right?
Oh yes. Otherwise, Joan would not be happy with me.
Oh yeah. So what was that? I mean, you mentioned Betty Davis, and of course there's that legendary feud, which a few years ago Ryan Murphy turned it into a very interesting miniseries, which is a lot
Oh
of fun to
yes, and good
watch.
actresses.
Oh yeah, great performances in that.
Yeah,
Uh,
he cast with two of the best actresses in Hollywood, which was a great thing. And I loved it that he was a little more empathetic with Joan than usually we see. Because
mhm.
part of that comes because as Betty Davis got older, if you look at interviews with Betty Davis, she's not as harsh on Joan as she is later, as she had the stroke. And, Betty Davis loved giving interviews. And so, she knew that was good material. Betty Davis was her own best publicist. And
Yeah.
that's where it was. So somewhere in between there is what they really thought of each other. They really did believe in each other as being top professionals, though. That was important. And both of them mentioned that in interviews earlier on.
Yeah. Well, going back to Rain, I mean, to me, one of the most sort of shocking and hateful performances, and I just mean in terms of the character, not the, I mean, the performance itself is incredible, but Walter Houston in this film, he's just on another level. So I know we mentioned him earlier, but for the audience who may not be familiar with the name Walter Houston, I mean, not only was he a highly respected, highly regarded actor in his day, but today he might be best known as the father of John Huston, the amazing filmmaker, the amazing director. He's John Huston's dad.
Absolutely. And of course, when he won the Oscar, when was it? Well, when his son directed him
And
in
yeah,
Treasure of Sierra Madre. But he had a long career before that. He's very well respected. In the pre-code, what happened was they decided to raid Broadway because they knew Broadway actors could talk. And so Walter Houston was one of the first one. He started Paramount, a movie called Gentlemen of the Press, with a very young Kay Francis. And then he did things at MGM, a real pre-code starter called Beast of the City with Jean Harlow. People should see that one. It's startling in what it's about. We think about Scarface, Little Caesar, and Public Enemy, but Beast of the City is something also to watch. So Houston came with all this great reputation, and then to play Davidson was a perfect. So at times the styles don't work as well as I like them to. A Milestone doesn't really measure that right, but in that scene where we actually see her transformation, where she cries, raw again, and he's there. It's a brilliant scene between the two of them. There is a chemistry that works between the two of them because they are so different. The scene works even better.
mhm.
And Houston went on to do Dodsworth on stage after that. Was nominated for the Oscar when he played it in the film for Samuel Goldwyn. He was in Yankee Doodle Dandy as Jimmy Cagney's father, and of course Treasure of Sir Madre. And then he also finished his career with one more western called The Furies, directed by Anthony Mann, who was one of the great directors who worked a lot with Jimmy Stewart, and it starred Barbara Stanwyck long after her pre-code period, of course. But so Walter Houston, and then of course John Huston, we got to say, is he's the only man in history who directed both his father to an Oscar and his daughter to an Oscar. And what a great thing.
Yeah. So in this, so this is a case where talent did run in the family.
Oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes.
So what about the supporting players in Rain? Does anyone else stick out to
But
you?
when you were talking about someone that was really stiff and was like the opposite and was almost hateful, I thought you were going to mention Beulah Bondi. She
Right.
plays his
Yeah.
wife. And she is like so stiff. This was her third movie, but that stiffness milestone worked. She made her debut in movies in Street Scene, recreating a role she played on Broadway. Like we said earlier, a lot of stage actors. And Beulah Bondi, now today we certainly don't remember her as this kind of a woman who's like so right down stiff about religion, and that this is such a sinful woman. I don't even want to smell her in the same room. And, later on she becomes Jimmy Stewart's mother in many movies.
Hmm.
She becomes the epitome of who we want to love. And then Remember the Night, she's Fred McMurray's mother. So different, so brilliant. And later on, she was an Emmy, not an Oscar, an Emmy for an episode of The Waltons, where she plays a combination of both. A woman that is a little maternal, a woman that's also stiff-necked and right on down the line, and a little nasty at times. Brilliant, brilliant actress. What a
Yeah,
character, Beulah Bondi.
yeah. Wonderful performance. And you had an interesting note about the screenwriter of the film, which you brought something up which I hadn't heard before.
John Colton. John Colton wrote the original play,
Oh, right.
and then when he came to Hollywood, Universal put him there, and he wrote two of the great classics of Universal horror in that the pre-code period. Actually, right after the pre-code, we should say, but certainly influenced
Sure.
Werewolf of London and The Invisible Ray, starring Mr. Legacy and Boris Karloff. So that's quite a difference from Rain,
You know,
but
it's
he
kind
was
of
very
funny you say.
talented.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. But it's funny you say that because I'm a big fan of Werewolf of London. I'm a huge Universal horror fan. But in a lot of ways, when you
I'm
think
here.
about this film, Rain is probably more horrific and shocking by today's standards than those actual horror
uh,
films.
I'd say yes, yes. Probably Joseph Breen had more nightmares about Rain. I would think so. But
Yeah.
yeah, and and it's based on a story by W. Somerset Maugham, who wrote
Hmm.
The Letter, which was a great movie. And I'm sorry if I'm going back to Gene Eagles again, but the original version of The Letter starred Gene Eagles, and that's the only picture of her. She only made two that we have, and there she is, raw as raw can be. And Maugham always liked to set his things up in the South Seas. So that's where we are again. And of course, later, Betty Davis, in what I consider her greatest performance, did The Letter for William Wyler.
You mentioned seeing Joan Crawford when she was still alive, but that wasn't the last time you saw her.
Well, well, at least her spirit.
Sure.
Uh, yeah, I moved to New York in '77. Young guy looking for work anywhere I could. But she died in May. I moved in April. She died in May. So late that month, they had a special public memorial service for her in All Saints Church in New York. And so I attended that. Pearl Bailey was there, she sang, Myrtle Lloyd talked. Actually, at that point, I had enough chutzpah being a young man that I recognized Brian Aherne leaving. So I went right up and started walking out with Brian Aherne. So it was nice. And all he did talk to me about was how wonderful a person Joan was. And this was a very sad moment for Hollywood, losing perhaps the greatest star. She herself considers herself more a star than an actress, which she was more an actress than she thought, but perhaps she was the greatest star.
And this is what's wonderful about the film, the motion picture medium, even more. I mean, the unfortunate aspect of being a stage actor, of course, once you do it, you're living in the moment. It's an amazing visceral experience. But once that show is over, that's it. It's lost to history. But here we are, 90 years later, 95 years later, and Joan Crawford is just as powerful, beautiful, and magnetic as she was when she made the film.
Absolutely, absolutely. She's just, she was a star,
Yeah.
and that kind of thing doesn't not fade away. That kind of charisma, it still emanates from the screen 92 years later, and that's important for that role because if Sadie Thompson doesn't have something going for her that way, everything wouldn't work. She has a certain allure, a certain charisma that drives men to her, like a real Jezebel. But she really wasn't. But she was like a real Jezebel. One more note I want to add to the the Davis Crawford feud is that some of the times, some of the writings, as I've gone through so much of my research, they find that some of it was rooted in Fran Chautone.
Hmm.
The actor Fran Chautone. He
Yes.
became Miss Crawford's second husband. But Betty Davis loved him. They did Dangerous together, the movie that she won the Oscar for and consolation prize for Of Human Bondage. And that was the beginning of it because she wanted Francho and Joan got him.
Mhm.
So that was part of the feud too. I'm sorry, I just had to add that just so we wouldn't leave it out.
Well, that was the impetus. Well, yeah, that's certainly. I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm certainly glad that Joan Crawford wasn't able to burn all the copies of Rain. I'm happy it still exists.
Me too. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing is, it fell into public domain then, so it became much more available than most of her movies because
And
MGM
that
had a tight lead on things.
and that's why we're showing it tonight because it's in the public domain. Well, Stan, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ryan. It was a great time talking about Miss Crawford.
Oh, yes, it's always a pleasure talking with you. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.